All right, g'day everyone. My name is Luke Ledwich. I am a staff engineer at Riot Games, and for today, you'll probably just have to use a lot of imagination when I try and say, look at the screen and visualize this. I'm a staff engineer at Riot Games, and I've been asked to talk about what the day-to-day of a Riot engineer is. Hopefully, from this talk, you'll get a little bit of understanding of the skills and values that help them succeed, and a little bit about how we search for these in our candidates. Now, the things I would like to talk about today include myself and what I do, as well as a little bit about Riot Games Sydney and about this studio and how we fit into the larger Riot Games ecosystem. Then I'll move on to the bulk of my talk, which is going to follow a structured pattern of first talking about a subset of skills and values that Riot seeks in our engineers. And then for each one, I will go into the day-to-day activities of an engineer, which leans heavily on this skill. And finally, how you would translate your experience and learning to showcase that skills in an interview-based environment. Finally, at the end, there might be some time for questions, but given current technical problems, maybe not. So, what do? I'm a staff engineer, which means I work above the team level at Valorant, and I work generally between teams and help them achieve their goals in various different projects. In particular, I work in the core game area of Valorant, which focuses on the gameplay. And you can imagine a wonderful screen of Valorant. I hope you've seen it before, but the abilities and the weapons and the second-to-second gameplay is where I work. And this is mostly with a lot of designers and artists to make sure that the game looks and feels awesome. Now, Valorant is just one of Riot's games, and games is at the center of what Riot does. There is a lot of additional things we do, including things like esports and film and books and comics and community events and everything. But all of these additional things are centered around a center of games. Now, there's a slide showing all this, but we have 6 games currently in Riot, and 5 of them are worked at Riot Games Sydney. And to do this, we support various streams of work, such as gameplay and engine and social features or data sciences or foundational services. And to do so, we employ most disciplines across games, such as art, design, QA, and of course, engineering. Now, it's important to come back to this center. It's like, while we have the most passionate players, we look to create values for them in all kinds of ways, games are at the center of what we do. And everything comes back to jumping online with your friends and playing some meaningful games. Now, while we do work in Riot Games Sydney in the central of what is Riot's focus in games, geographically, we are not. We are on the far side of the world to the majority of Riot Games, which has a primary campus in Los Angeles, and they also have significant development hubs in other cities along the west coast of the US, as well as smaller studios like Sydney in Europe and Asia. Now, this distance is a challenge which makes working at Riot Games Sydney a non-typical and varied experience compared to many AAA studios. Now, for the core context of this presentation, there are just 3 skills I would like to focus on. And why these 3 areas is mostly because I like alliteration. So we're going to talk about communication, craft, and curiosity. Now, these are definitely not the only 3 qualities and skills we look for in an engineer, and nor are they most important for any given role. However, they are 3 things that all writers share, use on a daily basis, and are definitely discriminating factors between candidates. And before I go into the details of these skills, I sort of want to talk about the persona engineer of whose day-to-day I'll be referencing. To be clear, it's not me. My current role is project-based on current needs of Valorant. But most engineers at Riot, from our interns up to our seniors, are part of a team that has clear responsibilities and a roadmap of tasks and ownership. As I mentioned before, though, they could be supporting any one of 5 games. And these games can be built on any different kinds of tech stacks and focusing on very different kinds of problems. So prior to my role where I am now, I was an engineering manager for a couple of teams on Valorant, and I'm going to lean on that experience to have this theoretical engineer who works very closely to the player experience in the game on one of these teams. It's also worth mentioning my assumptions about you in the audience. While many of you will be early career, these experiences I will talk about apply all the way up to senior engineers and managers. Many engineers in Riot did not start in games, and this includes myself, and we moved sideways in their mid-career. So as a point of interest, we recently had visitors from the US from my area, and we had a whole circle of gameplay engineers where the majority of them did not start in games, nor did they have a traditional computer science degree. They're all very talented and experienced engineers, but they did not start there, and they bring a diversity to experience that can be very valuable. It's also worth highlighting that most of the talent recruited at Riot Sydney is from the local source, and there's not a lot of AAA experience here, but there is a lot of experience in adjacent industries, and they bring a lot of value when they join Riot. And we'll talk a bit more about this when talking about craft. So let's talk about the first skill I want to highlight, which is communication. And there's a reason it's first, because it is heavily involved in Sydney's day-to-day life. Remember that slide that showed us on the far side of the world? Well, modern technology has really shrunk that distance. It's not a massive concern with the advent of effective remote, hybrid, and work-from-home solutions. But the time difference between these two places is still massively impactful to how we work. By the time our example engineer has woken up in the morning, the majority of Riot has completed most of their workday. Meetings will have happened, decisions made, and questions asked. So the first thing we do in the morning is we catch up. We read threads in Slack. We respond to activity on our Swarm reviews. We look to updates in Jira tasks and updated documentation or project status. And on occasion, you watch meeting recordings or videos of bugs and features that are currently in development or breaking. Now, you should note there is not a lot of talking here. Even though when I said communication, people leap to the confident speaking skills that are implied by it, but it's equally important to listen and to read precisely and to comprehend the information available. And now that our engineer is up to speed because they've read all of this, it is time to talk, and this is a new challenge. In winter, in the Southern Hemisphere, like right now, there is a single overlapping business hour to talk directly to your peers in LA. This is a chance for scheduled meetings to happen to align with a greater team or adjacent team or your area. But for the engineer, this is usually the chance to reach out and chat with an SME. A little insight if you work with Riot and other American companies is they love their acronyms. So this means you would reach out to the subject matter expert, which is basically a person who knows an awful lot about something you're interested in. And this is a very common act by our engineers. But the inverse of this is also true. Without a doubt, at any level, an engineer at Riot will become an SME in many things, which means people around the world will be reaching out to you with the same constraint of direct overlap, which makes this very brief overlap time with your peers very precious. So the ability to efficiently and effectively communicate is essential for a Riot engineer based in Sydney. Now, the engineer will have the rest of their day to progress the work, but towards this end of the day, you will have made progress on your projects. And of course, you'll have fixed every bug that you came across, which is because they're just bugs, you just fix them, right? But again, meetings will have happened, decisions will be made, and there will be questions to ask. So now it's time for you to do the same as your counterparts outside Australia, which is to put updates in Slack, to ask questions to be answered overnight, to update your tickets in Jira, or to put Swarm reviews that will need a peer review from an SME outside Australia, or even record a video of your latest cool piece of work, which is a great way to build rapport and to show progress and to just get engaged with the project. It's even better if it's a bug, because I really love the wacky and zany things that can come out of bugs in the middle of development. And then we go home and live our lives and sleep, knowing that our colleagues will be working while we sleep 1,000 miles away. Now, communication is always the first and the last thing we do each day. It's something that we definitely and directly search for in our interviews. And we also ask about it indirectly, just generally the passive process of interviewing. But it's not the easiest concept to highlight how to show good communication. However, there's a couple of things we could point out here. The first one is to make sure your written documentations don't have error. And this is where it takes effort to communicate well. It takes effort to choose the right words, and it takes time to make sure that they land well. So spend the effort when you write in communications as part of the interview process. When answering questions, it's very effective to be precise, to pass that information across well. If you don't know the answer, it's often better to describe the limit of your knowledge as opposed to waffle on and keep it ambiguous. And the last part is to take your time, to not be afraid to be silent, and to collect your thoughts and deliver your message well. Which brings us on to the second skill that we look for, which is craft. And when I say craft, I'm talking about all the skills and experiences that come with your discipline, or in this case, engineering. And there are serious craft requirements to succeed in games. Now, I'm sure that every industry can say the same thing about their industry. I'm too long in the tooth to make wild claims about which one is more challenging. I mean, all software engineering has a technical challenge. This is why engineers exist. I mean, if we would be honest, I think rocket science might take the crown. Or maybe a game about rocket science. But from my experience, this is how I see engineering games is different, or the challenges we face particularly that make our space compelling. Full hardware utilization. There are very few pieces of software out there that stress every single part of their hardware. The CPU, the GPU, the RAM, the cache, the disk, the bus, the network, power consumption, heat, all of these things can affect your game. And because they can all affect your game, it actually makes a lot of these problems hard to solve because you can't lean on one to help the other because all of them are generally pushed towards their limit. And this is not for everyone, but low latency networking is common in games, as is a very high fidelity bar, which comes together in a way and interleaves itself because we're trying to build a client first, so we're talking about the player here, extremely low latency network experience under very uncertain conditions because we do not control their hardware, at a very extremely high fidelity bar because the player is engaged with this game and they care about the outcome very highly. And the difference of milliseconds and a poor resolution of an outcome is very noticeable to them, and they will tell us about it. And the last part is games is a cross-discipline effort, and more importantly, is where each part is as important as the other and critical to success, as well as they all need to compromise with each other. Games is trying to reach the highest level of fidelity and realism and simulation, and sound and audio and game systems, but with every corner cut. It's a very interesting trade-off and dynamic. Now, as for craft itself, I'm going to gloss over this section a bit because honestly, the details aren't tremendously informative. And on topics I can't talk about without incriminating ongoing projects. But when a Riot Sydney engineer gets to the bulk of the day, there isn't really any surprises. At its core, for the engineer, game development is software development. They design systems, they implement functionality, they test their code, and they debug defects that exist. This process is not different from any other software studio out there. You're going to take ownership of a task. In Valorant particularly, this would be a task in Jira. You're going to understand the problem, which would be to understand the system you're working with or reproduce a bug. You would identify a solution, which is to... Sorry, I lost my page. Well, it's identify a solution. And then you're going to implement said solution. You'll then post a peer review to get your code reviewed. This would be using Swarm. And then you'll submit your change to source control, which will be via P4 in Valorant. Lastly, you're going to sort of wait for your build to pass continuous integration, which basically tells you that your change works with the rest of the large-scale project. And the last thing you do is you'll have a test plan. Now, this is where games does vary a little bit to other industries in the fact that it may be very hard for you to test your feature that you've implemented in games directly. You will have to wait until there is a playtest of enough people. That might be tomorrow when you have a team playtest or a studio playtest. At the very least, you know when your change will be fixed and when you can finally close out your feature as done. Now, the one difference is between us and other software things is our tools and environments we use are often uncommon and in many cases quite obscure. At Riot, working on a game client, you will need C++. This is not that uncommon. But we also work in places that get very specialized very quickly. On Valorant, we use Unreal. Again, not that common, it's used outside of games, but it is the primary purpose. And as we get closer to the game, we start to get closer to Unreal-specific features which are very specific to games. For instance, blueprints. Blueprints are how all the gameplay logic in Valorant is designed, and this is where you will do a lot of your gameplay work. You'll start to get into other industry standards, such as WISE for audio, or Unreal-flavored versions of AI and animation state machines, particle systems materials, and this is where it becomes very specialized and very specific to Unreal and how they work. Now, all this said about these unusual and specialized knowledge, I want to latch onto the core of this section is that despite these requirements, game development is still software development. So it very much depends on the same fundamentals. And during an interview, you can show your craft for games by showing examples of your software development fundamentals. Tell us how and why you designed a system. Tell us when a debugging technique failed and when the alternative that you tried succeeded. And it's not a favorite topic, but an excellent point of candidate in favor is to show us how you improved a process, because it shows your interest in improving the craft. This importance of fundamentals and the way that they translate is why it's feasible to move into games mid-career or later. It's not true of every position, but there is a lot of flexibility in your hard games knowledge and experience because of how these fundamentals translate. It's definitely a competitive advantage in any role to have a lot of games experience, but it's not a hard constraint. You don't need to ship a game to begin your career in games development. And my page won't move on. So the last topic I'd like to talk about is curiosity, and it comes on this idea that building on a ground of foundation of fundamentals, your curiosity is a very valuable skill to go the next step. Even after 20 years, I am regularly encountering problems that my experience does not properly prepare me for. And this is not something special in games, it's the core principle of an engineer, which is to understand a problem space and create a novel solution. Experience will help with the former of understanding a problem space, but not so much with the latter. As an example, I worked on my thesis in computer vision when I was a young lad, and 20 years later, that happens to be the technology that drives AR. And when I was working on AR experience, I had a lot of context. And having this context about the problem space, while very helpful and gave me good guidance, it was not what I needed to do and understand to solve this new and exciting problem. And take note, in this case, it wasn't even game experience that allowed to give me this context. It was from robotics. So curiosity is something I value very highly, and it's something I try to foster in any of my young engineers, because it's very useful for the kinds of problems we face. And I think these are amplified in games. And one of the reasons is every game is different. At Riot Games particularly, League of Legends shares very little with Valorant. Even if we looked at first-person shooters, each individual first-person shooter shares very little code as you go on. The systems may be similar, but the implementations matter to the point that the specific knowledge and understanding what that game is trying to achieve makes a big deal. Tech moves very quickly in games. Every generation of console and PC and upgrades in these versions change what the requirements are. So the network latency requirements that I cut my teeth on in the 2010s and whatnot no longer even apply today. Those slow 150 milliseconds that were acceptable just do not apply to today. Even the hardware and hardware architectures such as PS3, which was fairly traumatic to work with, is no longer relevant. All the knowledge built up there. The last thing is the design in games is always iterating. It's a key part of game development. And that doesn't stop when the game goes live. Design is still iterating. And this means that there's very little static documentation or very little static knowledge that applies to the current version of the game. The only sources of truth is the live game and how it behaves right then in that moment, and the code or the content that drives it. So let's ground this in the concept of how this affects the day-to-day of an engineer. Any given day, an engineer will need to understand something outside their domain. For instance, I needed to enable my system in a game mode, which requires a server change. I'd never written Go before, but that was something that I needed to do. They may need to understand deeper than their current mastery. I know a decent amount of physics and game logic, but I hit a problem where my sphere tracers were unreliable in the engine. And at that point, I had to go back down into the Unreal Engine and figure out what was wrong. You may need to evaluate something new. Something that's currently Valorant is doing is we are upgrading to UE5, and there is a cool feature. We need to know if we want to take that and we want to use it. And this is something that I've never seen before. And lastly, being curious about a better way. Because this is important for being curious and having a growth mindset and generally being the force multiplier that engineers should be. You want to find a way to do your job better so that you can help more people and have more impact. And these are all real examples that I've encountered in the last 12 months. So speaking about how you can show this curiosity in an interview is pretty straightforward, actually. It's ask questions. Engage with your interview. Be curious. Let them guide you. There's often a stigma about asking questions, and that may be true depending on your landing. Just saying what or can you repeat that kind of implies you weren't listening. But asking for clarification, I've never held that against a candidate. Are we talking about X or are we talking about Y? And it can definitely guide you in the appropriate level of detail. Would you like me to go into details? Would you like me to tell you less about this and focus on the high level stuff? Or alternatively, show them that you have breadth in this thing and that you've considered something. It's like, oh, I'm thinking about Z. Do you think you want to hear about this for this problem? Because the act of asking questions is the act of being curious, and doing this in an interview will show that you are curious. The last part is examples of your experience that show you did not know the answer, but went and found one are perfect for highlighting curiosity and good engineering skills. It shows a tenacity and a willingness to find the right root cause of something. People are often unwilling to admit a mistake or unwilling to say that they failed first, even if they did get the answer later. But showing the process and the ability to go and find and test and dig deeper shows a very good engineering skills that will be practically applied when any of the above things happen, when things are outside your domain or beyond your mastery. And I want to come back to that last point in particular of finding a better way. Because it goes so much further than engineering, and it can apply to almost anything you see at Riot. It can be how you test. It can be the processes for logging a new bug. It can be even the content of the game and how it lands. You have the ability to impact these things. Depending on your level, it's easier and or more difficult to apply it to certain things, but they are all within your purview to improve, because this is what makes a good engineer. You're always looking to make the product better for the player. And I don't mean that carelessly. Engineers are often seen as very far away from the player, but games are centered to what we do, and players are at the center of games. And putting players first is one of Riot's values. And it's the most important thing a potential candidate should be curious about. The values of the company you wish to join. I was about to show you a slide of all Riot's values. I may as well list them off, but they are player first, curious about games, dream and deliver, in for the long term, and one Riot. And as you can see, player first is right at the top of this list. And these are core to every day of a Riot engineer. I don't want to go into details about this because I want you to be curious about them and about Riot itself. And if you just search for Riot in game values, it will bring you to a site which will go into better detail than I ever could. These are present in our day-to-day, and there's a reason they are present in our process. They're rarely interview process. They're rarely called out directly. But I want to sort of stress that understand that we hold these values and we seek others that share them. And that should probably be enough to guide how you present yourself. And that's it. Apologies for not having the slide and all the additional information. And I think my lights have gone off, so I have to stand up. So questions? Here we go.
Thank you very much, Luke. That was a great presentation. I confirm that I have received your slides. Well, I have received the link to them, and you need to give me access to them. But what we'll do is we'll share them after the summit to everyone who attended. Nevertheless, I think that was a great presentation. Thank you so much. So if anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat here, and I can relay them back to Luke. All right. Well, thank you for the positive feedback. So if anyone has any questions, Luke's still available. And we can give it a couple of minutes before we have the next speaker join. So don't be shy. There's a question here from Alex. Are there any specific things Riot does to help foster curiosity/learning on the job?
Directly and indirectly. So I try to foster curiosity in my reports. One of the things I try to get my junior engineers is to ask, go and ask the person that they're curious about. Don't let me answer it, even if I may know the answer. I try to send them to the SME. I try to send them to the code, to read the code, to understand what it is. These are all fostering skills so that they can be curious about something and go and get the answer themselves and have the independence for when they are blocked or when I'm unavailable or when their buddy is unavailable. Directly, there's also learning funds to help you learn things. So should you want to learn a skill, there is a application process for trying to get an online course or whatnot to help you out.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We do have another question here from Matt. If engineers didn't come from computer science, what else was common?
Part of this is they had some form of programming minor. So in my case, I was doing robotics. There was a lot of C. So I had a basics in C, but not in computer science. So I didn't know anything about data structure and algorithm, but I did know how to program. And that was sort of in the avenue, and the work would let me develop programming skills. In others, it was things like they would be interested in political science or some other form of data science, and they would still be programming on the side.
Thank you. What else do we have? How easy was it to pivot into games with a robotics/mechatronics degree?
It was a long and slow process is the short answer. Most of that was on me, though.
There we go. What is communication like between different departments at Riot, for example, engineering, art, and design? And that
very good.
Came from Lauren.
One of the nice things we have at Riot is it is almost you can reach out to almost anyone at any level and ask them a question, and they will give you the time of day and will help you answer it. And this means that even if you're asking something sort of alpha kilter, you can still go and ask it. But when it's your team, it means most people are always available to find 5, 10, 30 minutes to talk to you about something you may be facing. The only catch is trying to get them in business hours. Like I said, is that 1 hour in winter. It does get to be a little more generous when we get towards summer and daylight savings kicks in and people's personal time, how they work. So a lot of people in America actually shift their hours to account for LA traffic. So they come in later and leave later, and that actually helps out a bit.
You got LA traffic. I never thought that that's something that would figure into Australian game development, but here we are. All right, look, Jesus. All right, look, we're going to do 2 more questions, and then we're going to slowly move to the next presentation. So we do have another question here from Stephen. For career changes with a history in programming, would they be considered senior as a senior programmer with a little games experience?
Yeah, so it's an interesting concept when you move sideways into games, or in any industry, actually. This is not specific to games. You have to be able to do the job that you're coming into, and your level of proficiency may not be directly up to scratch. But if you are coming into a job, you will be a senior engineer, but you will be expected to learn your craft to be effective as a senior engineer in that role. We wouldn't be bringing you on in that position if we didn't think you could do it. So this does mean that you may probably be, how would I say this, an advanced senior engineer, and you would enter and your actual effectiveness might be at a learning level, but you wouldn't come into a role that you would be set up to fail. I hope that answers that part of it.
Excellent. And we do have one last question, and of course it's inevitable. What's your opinion on AI and its uses in programming?
That's an interesting one. I'm probably actually going to bow out on that, mainly because it's not something I engage with heavily. AI is not something that I can use in my day-to-day job effectively, so it's not something I've dug into.
All right. Well, okay. Well, with that in mind, let's do one more question then. Looking at positions at Riot, specifically in Sydney, there don't appear to be many offerings in some areas. Do you take general applications outside of advertised roles?
Not quite my expertise, but generally, no. You generally apply for a position. That's, I think, standard across the industry. There's very few general applications to games.
All right. Okay, well, team, keep your eyes open to see what roles there are, right? But Luke, thank you so much for your presentation. Really appreciate it. Like I said, we did this all in a dry run. It all worked perfectly, but I still really like the presentation. I think you did a great job here, and there's some really fantastic insights, and we will circulate the slides among everyone who attended today. So Luke, thank you very much for coming along. Everyone else, stay tuned. We'll be right back with Q&A at Tantalus. Take care, everyone, and see you in a minute. Bye.